G'day guys and girls, KennyRaceBoy here and welcome to my garage once again. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of an instructional. You guys wanted to know how to remove the swing arm and lube the pivots of your KLR650. So I'm going to show you how to do that and let's get right to it. Now there's a number of reasons why you'd want to carry out this procedure. Number one being that Kawasaki don't do a really good job of lubing the pivots to begin with, and number two would be just general maintenance. First thing we're going to do is just raise the Kawasaki up off the back wheel. I'm using a center stand here, or you can use some sort of jack. Next we can remove the rear wheel. Removing the rear wheel on the KLR is very simple. All it requires is some pliers and a 27mm socket. Push the rear wheel forward enough so there's enough slack in the chain to remove it from the sprocket. Slide the rear brake caliper off its support and hang it off to the side. Next we can remove the retaining bracket for the rear brake hose. And further on in, there's a bracket that we need to remove that retains 3 hoses. Now we can begin to disassemble the suspension. Start by removing the swing arm suspension linkage. There's no real order in which you should remove these, just undo them as the suspension is not under tension. After the linkages are removed, we can now move on to the lower suspension bolt. Removing this bolt may take a little bit of persuasion with a rubber mallet or my patented wooden block. Next, remove the 2 caps either side of the bike located behind the foot pegs. Hidden behind these caps are the bolts that hold the rocker arm assembly in place. We can now proceed to remove this bolt by using 2 22mm sockets on either side of the bike. Once the retaining nut has been removed, we can use a rubber mallet or a wooden block to remove the bolt. Depending on how long it's been since you've removed it, or if you haven't removed it at all, it may take a little bit of persuasion to get there. This is the bolt that usually does get the most amount of wear, as it's the one that sits down near all the dirt, grime and water. I have lubed this bolt once before, but as you can see it has started to corrode again, which is why it's always a good idea to perform this procedure every once in a while. Up next is removing the swing arm from the bike. Start by removing this one bolt on the side of the swing arm. With the retaining nut removed, we can now support the swing arm with one arm and remove the bolt. Without the bolt, the swing arm should slide free from the bike. Now that's everything out, it's time for a bit of cleaning. Clean all the contact surfaces on your bike that involve the pivot mechanisms. Next, remove the bearing sleeves and clean them thoroughly, being careful not to introduce any dirt into the bearings. Apply an appropriate amount of grease to each sleeve and insert them back into the bearings. Be sure to clean up any excess grease as it can attract dirt. Now it's time to clean the rocker arm pivot bolt. We can use some degreaser to clean any excess grease. Lack of grease and maintenance can cause this kind of scoring on your bolt. Unfortunately there's not a lot you can do for it short of replacing it or sanding it smooth again. In my case I'm going to be reusing this bolt using fine sandpaper to create a smooth surface again. With the bolt cleaned and lubed, we can reinsert it back into the bike. Once again using a rubber mallet or wooden block to tap it home. Using a torque wrench, tighten the rocker arm pivot bolt to 98 Nm and replace caps on both sides of the bike. Using the same method as previous, you can clean and lube the bearing sleeves for the swing arm. It's time to put the bike back together. Lubricate all remaining bolts for a quick assembly. Now for possibly one of the hardest parts of this tutorial, which is putting the swing arm back into your bike. It's a very tight fit and may require a little bit of jiggling to get it to seat properly. Once everything is lined up, insert the bolt back into the swing arm. Using a tiny bit of thread locker, reattach the retaining nut. Then torque this nut down to 86 Nm. Reassemble the bottom pivot and dog bone assembly, ensuring to use adequate grease and Loctite on each bolt. Using a torque wrench, proceed to tighten down each bolt. All of these bolts on the lower pivot assembly take 98 Nm. When reassembling, be sure not to forget these two hose assembly brackets. Before we put the rear wheel back in, press the pistons back into their caliper. This will make assembly easier. And finally, it's now time to fit the rear wheel. Run the chain back onto the sprocket first and then lift the wheel back into its place. Replace all the washers and spacers back in the order that they came off and tighten down the securing nut. Using a torque wrench, tighten this down to 98 Nm. And last but not least, replace the cotter pin that prevents the nut from coming loose. And there we have it, guys, all your swing arm pivots are lubed. It took me about an hour and a half's work to do this, so it wasn't too labour intensive. I'm going to post all the torque specifications in the box below, so make sure to check that description. If you want to follow me on Instagram or Twitter, you can do that. Descriptions on the screen, that kind of stuff. And as always, guys, comment, rate and subscribe, it really helps me out a lot. And until next time, I'll catch you later. See ya.